Hello, in this video I'm going to give a brief introduction to the respiratory system, and then we'll go through the path of air, trace the path of air through the body, and talk about the structures that the air is passing through. The respiratory system has a lot of different functions. Obviously we know it has something to do with air, and indeed the respiratory system serves as the surface area for gas exchange between the air and blood, and we call this external respiration. Because there's also a gas exchange that occurs between the blood and the tissues of the body, that would be called internal respiration. The respiratory system also functions to move air through the respiratory passages and through the lungs. Of course, the respiratory system is important for communication. I wouldn't be able to speak right now if I wasn't able to move air past my vocal cords. The respiratory system facilitates olfaction. Olfaction is just a fancy name for smell. So the respiratory system has olfactory sensory cells embedded in it that allow us to smell. The respiratory system is also involved with pH homeostasis. And this one's a little bit complicated. We'll spend a lot of time talking about this, but actually the respiratory system, by getting rid of carbon dioxide, is actually able to get rid of acids from the body. Now let's trace the path of air through the body. I'm going to come back to this picture, but we're going to start up in the head, and I want to show you a different picture that gives us a little bit more detail. We actually start with the nostrils, which are also known as nares. Most of the air is entering your body through your nose and not your mouth. Once the air has entered into the nares, it is now in the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity itself is separated into a right and left half by a wall called the nasal septum, and this wall is made of bone. Because we have a right space and a left space now, we call these individual spaces the nasal fossae. Within each nasal fossae, we're going to find bony projections called nasal concha, also known as nasal meatuses. And these bony projections are important because they're covered with epithelial tissue, and this epithelial tissue is going to filter the incoming air to remove debris, and it also helps to moisturize and warm up the incoming air. At this point, air can now actually go one of two directions. Some of the air will go into small openings that lead into the paranasal sinuses, which are spaces within some of the skull bones. Most of the air is going to go to the back of the throat, the superior portion of the back of the throat, known as the nasopharynx. From there, the air will move down into the oropharynx, which is the portion of your throat behind your oral cavity or mouth. Next, air will enter into the laryngopharynx, which is my favorite one because it's just fun to say. Now at this point, the tube is actually going to separate into two. The back tube is your esophagus, which is for food, and the front tube is going to be your larynx, which is going to be for air. There's a really important structure called the epiglottis, which is like a little door that can close over the opening to the larynx. This opening is called the glottis. So this is important because when you eat, you don't want food to go into your larynx and respiratory system. So when you swallow food, the epiglottis will close over the glottis, making sure the food is forced into the esophagus passage, and it doesn't enter into the larynx. The larynx itself is important not only for the passage of air, but within the larynx we also have vocal cords. And of course, vocal cords are important for speech production. So these are folds of tissue within the larynx, and they can be manipulated by muscle in order for us to produce speech and song. In this image, we can see the larynx here. And here is the epiglottis and the glottis. And this is the esophagus, the food tube that I mentioned. Let's take a look at this picture. We can see an anterior view of the larynx. There is some cartilage in the larynx that enlarges in males during puberty, which causes the formation of the Adam's apple. But once the air has traveled down the larynx, it enters into the trachea, and from there it can go into either a right primary bronchus or a left primary bronchus. The left and right primary bronchi have further branches off those that I'll talk about in a second, but let's take a look at the lungs themselves. So we have a right lung and the left lung. The right lung has 1, 2, 3 lobes to it, and the left lung has 1, 2 lobes to it. The left lung also has an indentation right here. This is because the heart sits between the lungs but slightly towards the left. So the indentation allows space for the heart to sit. And there's also less room for lungs, so there's less lobes to the lungs too. But now let's go back to that bronchial tree, right? So from the trachea, air will flow into a primary bronchus, and then eventually the diameter of those tree branches, so to speak, gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Eventually we get to bronchioles. From the bronchioles, the air enters into even smaller tubes, which are called terminal bronchioles. Terminal bronchioles sounds like it would be the end, but it's not. There are smaller structures even called respiratory bronchioles. And the respiratory bronchioles bring air to the alveolar ducts. The alveolar ducts bring the air to the alveolus, or alveoli for plural, which is the end of our pathway of air. At the alveoli, gases will be exchanged between the alveolus and a capillary. We have traced the path of air from the nares to the alveoli. But let's take a look at the histology of the respiratory tract. In order to do that, we first need to talk about the fact that we separate the respiratory tract into two sections based on the physiology. We have the conducting zone and then the respiratory zone. The conducting zone is mostly just involved with conducting air to the respiratory zone, and then the respiratory zone is involved with actual gas exchange. So the conducting zone goes from the nares all the way to the terminal bronchioles, and the respiratory zone starts at the respiratory bronchioles and ends at the alveoli. We can also separate the respiratory tract into upper and lower, in which case the larynx acts as the separation point there. I want to talk about the histology of the conducting zone here. The conducting zone is lined with a mucous membrane. So air is, when it comes into the body, it's contacting the superficial layer of this mucous membrane. A mucous membrane is made of a layer of epithelial tissue with some underlying connective tissue just to glue it down to whatever else is underneath that. And the epithelial tissue of the mucous membrane changes throughout the respiratory tract. When we look at the epithelial tissue of the mucous membrane in the upper regions of the conducting zone, we're going to see stratified epithelial tissue to help protect the underlying tissues. But as we get further and further down the respiratory tract, say towards the trachea, then we switch over to a pseudostratified epithelium, and then it switches over, as we go further down, to a simple epithelium. Embedded in this epithelial tissue are cells called goblet cells, and the goblet cells are shaped like a wine goblet, which is why they're called goblet cells, and they produce the mucus of the mucous membrane. Some parts of the mucous membrane also have mucus glands embedded within it, and the mucus glands, of course, are also going to be producing mucus. And this mucus is important because it serves to trap debris and bacteria and garbage, basically, that you're inhaling. And that mucus can then be passed up your trachea to your mouth, where you often swallow it. The pseudostratified epithelial tissue that is lining your trachea has cilia on it, and the cilia allows for that mucus ball to be passed upward towards your mouth. Some portions of the conducting zone are supported by a layer of cartilage that's deep to the mucous membrane. So we see this starting at about the larynx, and it continues down most of the bronchial tree. The cartilage is important because it prevents these tubes from collapsing. Towards the end of the conducting zone is where we will find our bronchioles and terminal bronchioles. The histology of the bronchioles and terminal bronchioles is very different than the histology of any of the bronchial tree above it. And that's because at this point, these tubes are so small, the wall is very, very, very thin at this point. So bronchioles and terminal bronchioles are mostly just composed of a layer of epithelial tissue, a layer of simple epithelial tissue, and maybe some muscle on the outside of the epithelial tissue. Oftentimes this muscle looks ribbon-like or strap-like, and we can see this in the picture over here. It looks like we have ribbons of muscle wrapping around this terminal bronchiole. And this muscle is important because not only does it support the tube, so in a way it helps to prevent it from collapsing, but not as strongly as cartilage. Additionally, the smooth muscle can constrict and relax. If the smooth muscle constricts, it's going to squeeze on that tube, just like if you took a belt and cinched it real tight around your waist, it would squeeze on your waist. So this belt-like smooth muscle is going to squeeze on the tube, closing off the lumen of that tube, preventing air from flowing through the bronchioles and terminal bronchioles, essentially diminishing the amount of air getting to the alveoli. When that smooth muscle dilates, the lumen of the bronchial and terminal bronchioles will open back up. And so we can regulate airflow to the alveoli by controlling the smooth muscle. Once air leaves the terminal bronchioles, it's now entering into the respiratory zone. The respiratory zone is composed of the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, and the alveoli themselves. All of these structures can actually participate in gas exchange, which is why they're considered part of the respiratory zone. Believe it or not, the walls of these are even thinner than the bronchioles and terminal bronchioles. So we're looking at simple epithelium, but maybe squamous here as opposed to maybe a cuboidal or columnar with the bronchioles. There's very little, if any, support on the outside of the epithelium. The respiratory bronchioles might have some smooth muscle around them on the outside, but for the most part, there's little to no support. And don't forget, this epithelium has to be really thin and squamous because those are the smallest cells that we can put between the air and the body, and that makes it really easy to get gases across that cell. Since we're talking about the histology of the respiratory tract, let's take a look at the histology of asthmatic tissue as compared to non-asthmatic tissue. So on the slide here at the top, we can see what normal tissue might look like from the trachea. We can see our layer of epithelial cells, right? And underneath that, we have a layer of connective tissue, followed by smooth muscle, some more connective tissue with mucus glands in it, and then some cartilage. This green layer here is actually mucus, so this would be the actual portion that's in contact with the air. The air would be here, so this is the lumen of the trachea. Notice our goblet cells, right? Those are helping to produce the mucus along with these mucus glands. Now let's go take a look at the asthmatic tissue. Notice the increase in mucus in the asthmatic tissue. The thick and increased amount of mucus within the lumen makes it very difficult to breathe. When we look at that layer of connective tissue that's deep to the epithelium, we can see that it looks very different. We have a lot of these blue cells all over the place, and these are mast cells. And mast cells release histamine and heparin. And histamine is one of the problems that we have with asthma. The histamine is going to cause constriction of the smooth muscle in this layer down here. And when that smooth muscle constricts, it's going to make the lumen of this tube smaller, cutting off airflow through it. Also notice the increase in the mucus glands in the layer that's deep to the smooth muscle.